Good afternoon, everybody. I hope everybody's doing well. We'll give a few minutes and let folks trickle in here a little bit. How's everybody doing today? Where's everybody from that's tuning in today? I am coming from San Antonio, Texas. Cody, Colorado Springs. I'm from Colorado myself, born and raised. Been living in Texas for a little while now. Kristen, Louisiana. Good to hear you. Chris, San Antonio as well. Trinidad and Tobago. That's nice. Denver. So Colorado in the house. Charlottesville. Nice, Edward. You'll have to hit me up when you get into town. We can grab a beer. We'll wait another minute or so and go ahead and get started. I wanted to, before we get started, just kind of everybody in the spirit of what this presentation was about, kind of, I'm not sure what everybody's background is within the industry, but kind of thinking about where you place the history of our industry, whether it be technical brewing aspect, history in your area and so forth, what importance you place that in how you approach your brewery and the beers that you do. All right, so we're going to go ahead and I'll make this full screen and we will kind of get started. I've got quite a number of slides. I'll try not to ramble on too much for you. I don't want to make history as dry as some folks often think that it is. But I'm going to kind of go through a little bit of some brief history of brewing in the Hoegaarden area of Belgium. A little bit on Witbiers in general, focusing on the Oud Hoegaards or the Hoegaarden Witbier specifically, and then kind of weave in Pierre Celis's story and importance over it. I have got quite a number of pictures I thought y'all might enjoy as well. All right, so kind of getting started. The title of this, of course, is A History of Witbier and Pierre Celis's influence over it. My name is Jeremy Banas. I'm a freelance writer and author. I go under the moniker of Ruination Press over the last 15 or so years. I've freelanced for local, state, and national publications. And this is the book that I recently had come out was on the history of Pierre Celis and Witbier, of course. And I've done 2 other books relating to beer history. Kind of starting off with the Oud Hoegaards beer, as it's referred to, or the Old Hoegaarden beer, as we all know, revived by Pierre Celis. It's actually one of 3 wheat or white ales that were brewed in and around the town of Leuven in the Flemish Brabant area of Belgium. I put a little map that I had put in the book on here for you so you guys can kind of see where Leuven is. And if you look at the inset, there is a little bit of a blow up as to where Hoegaarden is specifically relating to that. So what is a Belgian wit beer or white beer? So specifically with the Hoegaarden or Oud Hoegaarden's beer belongs to the family of white beers that were the specialty of the region. And that category took its name from the pale, whitish, and cloudy aspect of the beers. And I'll go into a little bit more on that here as well in just a moment, belongs to a broader family of wheat beers, which include Hefeweizens in Germany, but as wheat imparted a big part of that character. 3 different major types of wit or white beers were made in this area. The Leuven's-Wit, the Petermann, and the Petermann was actually brewed in and around Leuven itself specifically, and then the Odd Hoegaards. And Hoegaarden is about 30 minutes southeast or so from Leuven. That was one interesting aspect to me that I had a little bit of information on before researching this subject for the book, was that there was more than one style of wit beer, and that 2 others were being brewed around the time Pierre brought the Hoegaarden wit beer back. But again, I'll talk a little bit more about his specific influence and importance despite those other 2. General characteristics of Belgian wit beers or white ales, kind of summer running beers, meaning their shelf life was very, very short. They were not brewed to be stored or saved. 1 to 2 weeks from when they were brewed for a Hoegaarden wit beer is when when they were ready that you should actually consume it in the summer. For the Petermann, a few weeks or a few months, I'm sorry. And in the Leuven wit were actually even consumed while still fermenting. That was something that kind of took me a little bit by surprise. The use of wind malt was ridiculously prevalent, obviously a issue with technology at that time, but brewers were also the maltsters at that time, making them a special malt suitable specifically for white beers called a wind malted barley. And that may be familiar to some folks, so that this was not exclusive to this particular area of Belgium. It was a winter barley that germinated actually at colder temperatures and dried out by the action of the wind. So temperature as low as 77 to 78 degrees Fahrenheit without any kilning at all. It was actually mandatory for the style, and so a lot of care was taken to produce the palest or whitest malt, hence being described as whitish. Brewing in Hoegaarden actually dates back to the 1300s. That's when the first mention of brewing was found, and the first recorded brewing was in the 1400s. Those beers had a great success in Belgium from the late 15th century up until World War I. And the Leuven and Hoegaarden beers, wit beers, were specifically considered the most important among Belgian classics. But getting back a little bit to the characteristics of those beers, the use of unmalted wheat and other raw grains. Raw grains were part of the grist, mainly wheat, but sometimes oats and buckwheat. Barley provided the necessary enzymes, of course, for starch conversion. Oats and later buckwheat actually helped with mouthfeel and head retention. And those grains also allowed mellowness, which was sought after for that beer style. There was, of course, some tartness that was always going to get in. Those kind of beers were actually known to be a little bit sour or tart. In fact, even when Pierre brought back the Hoegaarden wit in the mid-1960s, his was known to be a little sour tart. Nobody cared. It was just part of it. The mashing in was made with cold water. Part of the wort was pumped, basically unfiltered, into a copper kettle and boiled before returning back into the mash tun. It gave the wort a lot of complex carbohydrates. The boiling time was actually very short as well. It was much shorter than most of the beers of those time. And again, only part of the wort was actually boiled. Spices, kind of a big characteristic of wit beers and Belgian wit beers, was it basically associated with 2 spices, coriander and orange peel, the curacao orange peel. Surprisingly enough, though, early indications, there's very little mention of what spices were used or spices in general in the old literature. It doesn't mean any weren't used, though, of course. What was very common in Belgium, and really, to be honest, still is what are brewer secrets. Somebody would say, "Here's exactly my recipe. Here's how to brew it," but 1 or 2 things were always held back. So it could have been one of those issues. But it seems coriander especially was indeed very often used, even if not always, but very often. But the important thing to remember is that all records talking about spicing mentioned that very little amounts were actually added. The goal was to enhance the flavor and definitely not overwhelm it. So we're going back now into about 1560s, kind of going into a little bit of history on brewing in Hoegaarden. Brewers in 1560 created a guild that had the reputation of having members that were very rich and powerful. Hoegaarden belonged to the Prince of Bishop in Liege, and all brewers were obliged to be officially Catholic and swear fidelity to the bishop and anybody that succeeded him. This regulation actually helped brewers quite a bit. Only indigenous cereals were allowed, so it allowed, kind of like with the German purity law, there were certain guidelines on what could and couldn't be used. Around 1900, though, farmers opted for new hybrid grains, which were easier to grow. Hops were also locally cultivated, mostly by private individuals and farmers, as most farmers were brewers and vice versa. But they were gradually replaced by hops from abroad, mainly the region of Brussels. As an example, I think around 1513 or so, early 1500s, Hoegaarden exported about 78,000 liters of beer outside of Hoegaarden. So some of this regulation allowed continued growth. And actually, a lot of that beer was exported to Leuven, who, as you know, had two different styles of Witbier of their own. But at the end of the 18th century, the village of Hoegaarden ended up exporting 3,250,000 liters outside of Belgium and going into the Netherlands. So around 1870, about 65,000 hectoliters of beer were brewed again in the village in 14 remaining breweries. The number was still about that until about World War I. But at the end of the 19th century, some farmer brewers were sharing breweries together. They each would help each other, so kind of a cooperative. They would share equipment, share resources. When it was their turn, they brought the beer to the cellars of their own farm, kind of a practice that had been common in Hoegaarden since brewing had started there. As with a lot of places in the world, and with Hoegaarden in particular, during World War I, production of wheat beer stopped as wheat was needed for making bread. Though this was, again, the case throughout every shortage in their history. After World War I, some customers were starting to seek other sorts of beers, lagers or stronger barley malt-forward beers, top fermented beers that were very popular at the time. So you start to see a little bit of lager brewing coming into the Flemish Brabant area in Hoegaarden in particular. Those beers were consumed then locally before slowly disappearing. Now, the last brewery in Hoegaarden that brewed its Witbier, that had been again around for several centuries, was the brewery of Louise Thompson. That closed its door in 1957. Louise Thompson is a little bit of a bridge in our story here, where we kind of now enter in with Pierre Celis. Pierre Celis had apprenticed with Louise Thompson in the 1940s in his teens before getting married. And Louise Thompson's farmhouse brewery was actually right next door to where Pierre Celis lived, the very home and farmhouse that Pierre would first start his brewery in. So when the Thompson Brewery closed in 1957, it left a little bit of a void in Witbier production at that time. In the early 1960s, Pierre would get approached, the way his wife tells it, would get approached by a lot of folks in town to try to revive it. They remembered that Pierre had brewed there and he knew the Thompson recipe, and they wanted their Witbier back. The Lures Brewery in Hoegaarden was still there, but again, it was one of the lager breweries. And so they wanted their beloved Hoegaarden wit back. Pierre decided to then reincorporate the family dairy farm into a brewery in 1965. Pierre was kind of looking for a change from the dairy farm, which he had taken over from his father, and had been brewing test batches on, basically home brewing equipment. He hobbled together some dairy equipment. He was a dairy farmer and used that to brew some of the initial batches. He did a lot of batches in secret at the family farm. And by 1965, he was kind of ready to open his own brewery. And this would be 8 years roughly after the Thompson Brewery had closed. So by 1966, he opened up the Celis Brewery at his farmhouse, much the way it had been done for centuries in that town. What was pointed out to me, and I think this is true in a lot of areas within Belgium and Europe, is if you saw a smokestack or a fireplace, chances are there was a brewery there at one point. But for a while, Pierre would quietly brew his Witbier just for Hoegaarden. He would, no one else. He's just starting out small, but he brewed it so quietly, in fact, that although everyone in the town knew he was doing this, his wife Juliet didn't. When I met with her a couple of years ago visiting Hoegaarden, she had remarked to me that, people would come to their dairy farm with milk jugs, and Pierre would happily fill them up. She didn't think anything of it because, well, they were a dairy farm, right? So she had no idea that he was actually filling the jugs with beer, and everybody in the town knew, it seemed, except for her. Of course, when she finally found out, she jumped on board with it and supported him. In fact, a lot of the family got involved with cleaning, bottling, everything. But it really didn't take too long for Pierre's Witbier to expand, and for word of his Witbier and his achievement to reach people, not just in his hometown, of course, but throughout Belgium. So it kind of started over time as essentially a regional beer, soon became, as we all know, a little bit of a global phenomenon, although Pierre himself had no intention of this. When he opened in 1966, he brewed first about 360 hectoliters, so about 9,200 gallons of beer the first year. That's actually not too bad on the system that he had. His yeast strain first came from the Loers brewery there in Hoegaarden. And again, remember, this was a lager brewery. At times when Loers didn't have yeast for him, he got yeast from Mont Saint-Guibert, not too terribly far away from Hoegaarden. What's interesting about the equipment that he got, obviously very different from the little hobbled together homebrewing equipment that he first had, was that this equipment came from the Zolder Brewery. And the Zolder Brewery, this equipment ended up having quite a little bit of a story that I didn't find until working on this book. And in fact, the gentleman who was helping with some resources to send me for this came across some of this information. And it turns out that the brewing equipment that he got was manufactured in Tournai, Belgium, around 1914. It had initially been purchased by a female brewery there in Belgium, which was behind enemy lines at the time. Remember, this is World War I. So not long after she took possession of her equipment, German soldiers came to her farm, stayed for a while, took advantage of her food and hospitality and beer. And as with copper being popular in a lot of wars, they ended up taking her copper brewing equipment and bringing it back to Germany. So she wasn't exactly content for this, and it's a little blurry as to how soon afterwards, but she somehow got back over to where her equipment was and stole it back, brought it back to Belgium, which makes it, as far as I can tell, the only copper brewing equipment that survived in Belgium that survived World War I. So I thought that was, quite a story. And I'm not sure if Pierre knew the history at that time. I wouldn't be surprised if he did. But certainly quite a bit of news and some pretty cool news, to say the least. But year later, 1967, we're moving forward here just a little bit. Again, Pierre's moving forward. The Witbier's going strong, but of course, he wants to introduce something else. So another very popular beer of his and of his brewery in the 90s in Austin, and I'll go into that in a minute, was his Belgian Belgian triple, because it was in Belgium, was the Cellist Grand Cru. And so at that point in time is when distribution began to move to areas around Hoegaarden at that time. Again, he's still getting his yeast, remember, at this time from Lours and a little bit from Mont Saint-Guibert. One little nugget that I also found in regards to the yeast that he was using was that the yeast specifically from Mont Saint-Guibert that he would get from time to time and later used exclusively until he propagated his own after the Lours Brewery closed, was that the Mont Saint-Guibert yeast actually dates back to or originates from William Younger's brewery in Edinburgh, Scotland. This brewery ended up merging with the McEwen's brewery in the 1930s, forming Scottish breweries. So in addition to Pierre and others using this strain, so did Duvel and Chimay and many others using yeast originating from the younger McEwen breweries. Breweries in Scotland often share their yeast strains, so the Edinburgh yeast kind of became a hodgepodge of different yeasts. A Belgian professor, Jean de Clercq, it was a Belgian brewing scientist, and he essentially said that they basically made, with all that kind of combination of yeast, one pure yeast cell selection. He himself helped a multitude of breweries around the world in his lifetime with this particular yeast chain, and it's being shared. And actually, when he passed away in 78, the monks of Chimay allowed him to be buried at their cemetery. So he's the only civilian to get that honor. But, you know, the way I looked at it was, in many ways, one could almost argue that the Belgian character that we describe today is attributed to, just in the last 100 years, to this yeast strain dating back to Scotland. So again, I won't digress on that, but I thought that was pretty interesting as well. It's hard to say, you know, what the character of these yeasts and these beers might have been way before that. In 68, just 2 years again, brewing is ramping up. He's getting more popular. He's local bars, obviously not just in Hoegaarden, but around Belgium, are starting to pick up his beer. Distribution outside of Hoegaarden was initially self-distribution by Pierre and members of his family, including his father, who actually helped him land his first bar account. And then others, like the very well-known Frank Bone, also actually helped. Frank, while getting his brewery up and going himself in Limbeek, actually helped distribute a lot of different beers, but was taken by Pierre and helped take his beer into Brussels. And that was actually Pierre's first foray into a large city. As he started to grow and get even bigger, he moved across town out of the farmhouse brewery to an abandoned lemonade factory called the Hoegaarden Lemonade Factory. Completely new equipment, and this new location slowed, kind of caused, although it was an expansion, a slow growth in the beginning as he's transitioning everything over and getting things moving with the brewery, but he was able to ramp back up. In 1981, a visit to the United States, which was probably one of the reasons that kind of sparked him to move a brewery here later on. And I don't really think that he had any idea the influence of coming to the U.S. Would really have on him, but he visited the U.S. in 81, and then by 84, the Odd Hoegaards beer and the Grand Cru were going to be first exported into the U.S. and Texas specifically, and that was through the Mannequin Brussels importers in Austin, Texas. But as with many wonderful stories, a little bit of tragedy befalls him in 85 when a fire near the brewery, actually not at the brewery itself, but near the brewery, started to engulf portions of the brewery. He was actually visiting in Atlanta, Georgia, some friends from Belgium at the time, and had to fly back to Belgium quickly to help with this. And much of the brewery was damaged from the fire. That was not specifically damaged was covered in soot. Because they thought that this was going to affect him so bad, his daughter Christine tells it that they basically had an ambulance or EMS on site, kind of ready in case he had a heart attack when he saw all this. But he had to have his beer brewed elsewhere, in this case, specifically Brouwerij Riva in the town of Dennergem for the next year. He was able to get some money together to help rebuild. But the reason he had to do that is, though he had insurance on the building, he was actually vastly underinsured. And so he wasn't going to have enough to completely rebuild. He had friends at Stella Artois, later purchased by Interbrew, which then became the company InBev. And so he was able to later reopen. At that point in time, although he was still majority stockholder, the new ownership kind of wanted different things out of it than he did, and it kind of made life really pretty miserable for Pierre. And in '89, he accepted a buyout offer from InBev. So at this point in time, he's not done with brewing. He wants to keep going. He's looking at the United States and those relationships he had built. And although Florida was his first choice, he ultimately decided that the southern area of Florida, the southern region of Florida, Miami specifically, he was looking at, was not going to work for him, because he said the population was too old and they go to bed too early, and that's not going to work well for selling beer. So knowing that he had some connections in Texas already through the importers that brought his Hoegaarden beer in, and a family friend was also now living in Austin. It had a young population and a vibrant university. He chose Austin, Texas. It was just kind of a bonus that the water profile was very similar. So with some Belgian investments this time and his majority ownership, him and his daughter Christine, in '92, he opened what became Austin's first new brewery since 1878. And although a couple of others were semi in planning at that time because laws were changing in Texas, it kind of spawned a plethora of breweries in Austin. And by 1995, Celis was getting so large it was available in over 20 states. And Pierre had difficulty keeping up with production. He was traveling around a lot. He was going, networking everywhere he could in the United States, and had already growing his reputation within the U.S. as well as already growing worldwide. So he needed help again. One thing I'll describe Pierre at is he was trusting to a fault. So after looking at various possibilities, he didn't have more money of his own to put in. One of his early investors in this new brewery that was from Belgium passed away unexpectedly, and that gentleman's children didn't want to reinvest. So he was stuck with looking for more capital. He ended up, as many may know, selling to a large portion of the brewery, about 80%, to Miller, which was owned by Philip Morris at the time. Miller, of course, not very long after, began dictating changes in the process, ingredients, and focus on the beer. I think Miller got in over its head. They had acquired Leinenkugel already before, and actually Jacob Leinenkugel is what helped talk Pierre into going down the road with Miller. But I think Pierre and his Belgian beers were a little too specialty for Miller, and they just simply didn't know how to handle it. So by 2000, Pierre and his daughter Christine sold their remaining shares to Miller, who essentially promptly closed the brewery. As some may know, the story of Celis wasn't exactly done. A gentleman that owned the Michigan Brewing Company purchased the equipment, the recipes, and the rights to the name, and started brewing those up in Michigan. So for many in Texas and around the country, it was kind of business as usual. Pierre even went up there to kind of, consult a little bit on the beer, make sure the first couple of batches come out the way they should. But after that, Michigan Brewing was kind of on its own. Many in Texas and the United States, of course, became very fascinated by Pierre. Again, as I mentioned, he had traveled all throughout the United States and throughout Texas and the world, kind of educating everybody on beer and brewing. He was happy to share, again, maybe to an extent, his recipes and techniques, and help and give guidance. Many throughout Austin, Brad Farbstein with Real Ale, and 512 Brewing in Austin, and many others would often go to Pierre. And I think it was kind of seen, not just within Austin and in Texas, but around the country, that if guidance was needed, you had this experienced Belgian brewer who was just the nicest guy, willing to help. After his brewery closed, though, again, he's still not quite done. He's now getting up there in years, but he's not exactly done. So he traveled the United States, again, continuing to help and influence. He started many brewing projects, including a cave beer project, which was referred as the Groton Beer, so cave beer. And that actually is still brewed. The project was essentially sold to St. Bernardus, and they still brew and age the beers in the same caves that he did. We're fast forwarding a little bit, but 2013 Michigan Brewing closes in 2013, and the equipment gets sold off. The name gets sold off, recipes, everything gets sold off. And so it's around this time that Christine Celis, his daughter, again, his partner in the first brewery in Austin, looked to get the rights to her name and the recipes back. So between 2013 and 14, to kind of start creating a little bit of buzz with the Celis name again, she collaborated with 2 breweries in Austin to create what she referred to as gypsy beers. Both of these beers were not beers that they had done at the brewery in Austin the first go around or in Hoegaarden. One was a Belgian style IPA, and the other was a coffee Dubel porter. And then in 2016, Christine's really able to kind of get things moving as far as opening up her father's brewery again. So with some investors, they begin construction on the new brewery. That opens in July of 2017 with their core group of beers. And that would be the Celis Wit. That would be the Cellist Grand Cru, of course, the Tripel. The Celis Raspberry, which actually has its origins in Belgium, the first go around for Pierre, but was very popular in the 90s in Austin. And then Celis Pale Bock, which was also started in the 90s for Pierre. It kind of was his answer to Shiner Bock, kind of his competition with it, because Austin was very much a Shiner town. Celis, what I refer to as Celis 3.0, because we have Celis before we have Celis in Belgium, we have Celis in Austin in the 90s, and Celis now. Had a little bit of an ownership change in early 2020, just as lockdown was hitting, but they continued to brew the same heritage beers as well as various newer beers. They do have a hazy, juicy IPA. They have more of a West Coast IPA, a couple of other fruited beers, and several others, the Bock and others that are kind of seasonal. What I think is Pierre's biggest legacy and kind of tying the history of brewing in Hoegaarden, history of Witbier, and Pierre kind of all together is that love of beer and that love of sharing. Pierre is unique in the fact that we can't normally point to one specific person who is kind of started or known for a particular product. However, in this case, we can sort of point to Pierre Celis with Witbier or white beer. He didn't invent Witbier, but he essentially reinvented it for everybody who brews it now. Again, knowing it was popular in Belgium before it died out, the Hoegaarden Witbier died out in Belgium in the late 50s, and the other 2 styles by the late 70s and early 80s. What we know as a Witbier now, what we define as a wit beer and its characteristics are the odd Hoegaards, and that is all due to Pierre Celis. So he outlasted the other 2 styles and took the style globally. So the reason anybody has it is all because of Pierre. You go see a Belgian wit on tap anywhere in Belgium, outside of, and you see a Belgian style wit, that's all Pierre. Shock Top, Blue Moon, that is all due to Pierre Celis. I'm going to kind of run through some slides here. I'm going to take it off the full screen if that is okay here in just a moment, but I'll kind of open it up to questions here in a second. But I do kind of want to run through some photos for y'all, and I'll do it semi-quickly so we can leave time for questions. And then kind of see what you guys think of these, but I think you'll get a kick of these photos. So this is a photo from the 40s when Pierre was apprentice brewing with Louise Thompson. So Louise Thompson is in the far upper left, and Pierre is the one holding the filtration basket. So keep an eye on that mash tun there that's in that photo from the Thompson Brewery. And we'll show you here in a minute. This is about 1968-69, and the little girl is Christine with a very young Pierre as well, outside of the farmhouse brewery. Here is the Louise Thompson mash tun. It and a couple of the other brewing vessels and his cool ship are actually at a open air museum in Boekrek, Belgium, north of Hoegaarden now. And so I had one of the gentlemen who brews off of that equipment to this day. They brew 6 times a year. Pose in the same manner that Pierre did. Christine in front of his original equipment. This is that 1914 vessel that Pierre got, that Pierre then covered up with wooden planks. Here is as it is now in its original form. It's a cafe in Hoegaarden. And this is outside Pierre's former home in Farmhouse Brewery. This photo is Pierre and Christine with the then Prince, but now King of Belgium in the late 80s. And this is the former lemonade factory that Pierre moved into when he renamed the brewery the Decluse Brewery in the late 70s. This is a picture of the fire of the brewery that we mentioned, and I thought the photo was great. Obviously, one of the firemen running forward there. All right, and I'm going to, much to Andrew's dismay, I'm going to take it off of full screen here for a minute so that I can kind of see anybody's questions, if anybody has any questions in regard to this, and I'll kind of go through a few more of the photos as we're talking here. So this photo here, the next photo here, let's see, I'm sorry. This is early 1990s when Pierre was opening up the brewery in Austin, and he had the Belgian copper equipment brought in to Austin, and that's a photo of it being lowered in. So they basically lowered the equipment in onto the concrete before building around the brewery. And so it's a little bit of the inside of the brewery in Austin. And it's hard to see in this photo. I'll see if I can make this full screen here real quick. In the middle left there, you'll see a gentleman in a fedora. That is a gentleman, Marcel Thomas, who was the brewer at the Lours and a good friend of Pierre's and consultant for Pierre in his early days of the brewery in Belgium. Photo of a restaurant in Hoegaarden with the Cellist Grand Cru original label, or Hoegaarden Grand Cru at that time. Another view of the equipment at the Austin brewery. This here is the tap room of the Celis brewery now. So taking a look at the top of that, copper kettle equipment. And so what Christine Celis basically did is she was able to find 2 of the 3 vessels that they brewed off of in the 90s and cut one of them in half to use as the top half of the bar there today. This is a flyer for the grand opening of the brewery in Austin. And let me tell you, it was almost like the Kardashians hit a small town in the Midwest with the number of people that turned out and the excitement and buzz that was created. This is actually back in Belgium. This is at the Decluse Brewery, the lemonade factory of Pierre's, him in front of it there. And this is at the Decluse Brewery, the lemonade factory again. And that is actually the gentleman to Pierre's right who's carrying the milk crate is one of the town mayors. This picture here is the original kettle that Pierre test batched off of before he opened up the farmhouse brewery. And the gentleman to his right, our left, is Chris Bauerotz, who is the co-founder of the Achouf Brewery in Belgium and is still a good family friend to this day. This photo here is around the time Pierre's book, well, not a book that he came out with, but a gentleman in Belgium had come out with a book that was a collection of interviews that he had done with Pierre over the years. And so this was a photo at kind of the release of that book in Belgium. And if you look at the photo here, the logo for Celis beers in the background has a Texas flag there. So that was the logo for the brewery when the beers were being contract brewed in Belgium while it was still open in Austin. And although this photo is a couple of years old, before the ownership change a couple of years ago, or last January, this is the outlook of the current Celis brewery now in Austin. This is a photo of Pierre at the end of his life. He'd actually already gone blind, so I think this was within a year before he passed. Characteristic Pierre smile, always staying positive despite definitely not feeling well at the time. And this is at Pierre's funeral. So anybody who's knows or is familiar with Pete's Wicked Ales would know Pete Schlossberg, the founder of Pete's Wicked. And Pete is sitting behind Christine Celis, who is the lady on the left of the table, blonde-haired lady on the left of the table, and Pete is right behind her. Pete was a good friend and traveling companion of Pierre's. Right across from him, the gentleman with the sunglasses on and white hair is an older Chris Barotz. And to his right is Frank Bone of the Bone Brewery. And then at the kind of the head of the table, facing us, is Rob Todd from Allagash, who had kind of befriended Pierre. So Rob and Pete kind of became the American delegation to Pierre's funeral. That is essentially everything I had as far as slides on this. If anybody has questions, I think we have a couple of minutes, or I can always talk offline to folks as well. Hello from Puerto Rico. Well, I certainly appreciate everybody's attention. I apologize for a couple of the spelling errors on my slides, but appreciate everybody attending today. I hope everybody got something out of this. If anybody has any questions on any aspect of the presentation today, the Witbier history, Hoegaarden's history, or Pierre Celis overall, please let me know. I'd be more than happy to talk with you about it. Jeremy at ruinationpress.com, and on Twitter and Instagram, it's basically just at Ruination Press. Well, again, thank you everyone for tuning in. I think that is our time limit on this. So hope everybody has a great rest of the day, and cheers.